Hi, I'm Gail Street, and welcome to Paths to the Present. November 1st, 2014 marked an important anniversary. 150 years earlier, enslaved people in Maryland gained their freedom thanks to a state constitutional amendment that went into effect that day.
Steal away, steal away.
To commemorate the occasion, the Montgomery County HIstorical Society presented a day of remembrance, complete with reenactors, oral histories, genealogy exhibits, and music. It's important to note that Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in Maryland. That's because only states that had seceded from the Union were required to comply. Maryland slave owners continued the practice. However, according to the event organizer, Eileen McGuckian, the political climate was beginning to change.
It's not so clear that the South is going to be successful in its rebellion against the Union. It's not so clear that that slavery is going to continue to exist in the United States. So there is a change of political change in the Maryland legislature. There's a social change in what's going on in Maryland. And by 1864, Maryland voters, white males, vote to have a constitutional convention, which occurs between April and September of 1864. And then, when that convention is put before the voters in October of 1864, just a few weeks ago, in Montgomery County, that constitution was overwhelmingly opposed. And that's true of the southern counties and on the eastern shore. In most of the rest of Maryland, though, the voters voted, not by a whole lot, but voted to ratify the new Constitution. And the only way that passed was because the votes of soldiers in the field, Union soldiers from Maryland in the field, were allowed to be counted in the vote. So it passed by a bare majority.
When the new Constitution took effect, Maryland became the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line to free its slaves by popular vote. At the anniversary celebration, a reenactor playing Lincoln's assistant, John Nicolay, read the key constitutional clause.
That hereafter, in this state, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of crime, and all persons held to service of labor or as slaves are hereby declared free. From the Declaration of Rights, Maryland Constitution, November 1st, 1864.
And the president shared his thoughts on the occasion.
The scourge of slavery is no longer legal in the state of Maryland. They have secured ratification by vote, and now today ask a few words from me for the occasion. I will say I am grateful exceedingly that the people of Maryland have by their vote ratified this Constitution. I congratulate you heartily. Maryland, our nation, the world, on this great event.
Also marking the day were performances by the Washington Revels Jubilee Voices.
Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan.
A musical group committed to the preservation of African American history and traditions through songs and reenactments.
Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. One of these mornings, bright and clear, gonna spread my wings and clean the air. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary,
cornerstone to the day was presentations by 6 direct descendants of African American families living in the area in the mid-1800s.
And they're each going to talk from their personal perspectives about what happened with their families, and a little bit before and a little bit beyond as well.
Warren Crutchfield felt especially moved to be addressing this crowd.
I am, along with my sister Elaine, are direct descendants of the slave family here in Rockville of the Bell Dawson House. When Eileen and I walked this area and setting up for this historical event, and we were talking about where we're going to put the tent, and I was listening, but I wasn't listening, because my mind went back to my ancestors, and I looked at the way the lawn was manicured. I looked at the boxwoods and how they were trimmed. I looked at the bricks coming towards this mansion, and I felt the presence of my ancestors because they were here. And now the 5th generation of those slaves is now sitting in this mansion talking about them and how they started.
Paul purchased the eventual 40-acre farm.
Diane Young is the great-great-niece of 6 siblings who attempted to escape from slavery aboard the schooner Pearl. When the ship was discovered, her relatives were taught a lesson.
The topic of conversation in the homes of the masters of the fugitives was the belief that these fugitives had been, and I quote, slaves in name only, for they had been treated very well. Hence, it was generally agreed that they were a bad lot and deserving of being sent to the southern slave market and made to realize the full, real horrors and worst conditions of slavery.
John Kelly married into a family whose ancestors were enslaved during this time. The Taylors came to Durwood with the Muncaster and Magruder families. The Snowdens worked in the households in the Brighton area. And the Newmans came to Sandy Spring at the behest of a Quaker.
Benjamin Hollowell and a group of Quakers had been trying to get some of the persons who were slaves to come to Maryland, and the understanding was that if they came to Maryland, as long as they behaved themselves, they would be considered free. So in 1862, Albert Newman, who had married a person from the Silasburg plantation, came to Brookville and traveled to the east toward Brighton to the Holland plantation, and that's where they stayed until after the Emancipation.
His first wife,
Suzanne Johnson's great-great-uncle, Philip Johnson, was interviewed as a part of the Slave Narratives, a 1930s federal writers project.
he was a slave on the White Plantation, which is now Annington, if anybody knows about Annington, out near White's Ferry. And Gwen and I went exploring one day, and I'll explain who Gwen is in a minute too. Went exploring in Annington and found that that's where Philip Johnson was a former slave. Annington looks like this today. And the slave quarter here was a slave quarter back then, and we assumed that maybe he lived there. Some of the slaves, I understand, lived in the upper part of the original house. So we were able to go inside and got lots of pictures. This was the back stairway where the slaves came up and down when they had to serve the whites. There was a picture of Stephen White. So his slave owner, he said it was a very nice person, and he liked the missus, he called it, but he didn't like the overseer. And he had something for him, he said, when he got to be free.
Sharon Duffin spoke of the effects emancipation had on her newly freed ancestors.
The immediate impact of emancipation beyond freedom itself was in having families unified, reunited, and the legalization of marriages. The other thing that was very important to them was education, because that was going to be what helped them make freedom real. It protect them from being cheated and so on and so forth. So 20 Rockville men joined together and signed a petition to the Freedmen's Bureau to establish a school. About 5 of them were able to sign their names. So of the 20, the majority were illiterate. Reuben is among those 20 names. The next important thing was the acquisition of land. Some folks stayed on, especially in the outer part of the county, stayed on as tenant farmers, and later had gathered enough money to buy part of that land from their former owners. That was the beginnings of several of the kinship communities you see scattered around the county, this town and that town, Prather Town, Stewart Town, and so forth, from purchasing large tracts of land.
Irene Snowden Curry grew up in Rockville. Her father established the Snowden Funeral Home on Washington Street. She recalls her grandmother trying to tell her about her family's history.
Believe it or not, when I was a child, my grandmother talked about her cousins, and she would give me the lineage, but I didn't write anything down, and I didn't think it was interesting. She told me about my cousins her relatives who were in Canada and went through the Underground Railroad from here to Canada. I said, that's fine, I'll never meet them. But how wrong I was. My cousin Mabel Thomas received a call from the Canadians back in 1981 and said it was time for us to get to know each other. And I'm going to show you, this is how it started. And our first gathering was in Sandy Spring, and this is that. We have our reunions every 2 years. This was in 2012. We were in Hamilton, Ontario. And this is one here this year in Boer Park this year. And this is just a part of my grandmother's family. These are me and all of my cousins.
Sidney Katz, who now represents Montgomery County's District 3 on the County Council, was in the audience and had these thoughts.
You know, first off, it is so difficult to believe that people were held in slavery. I mean, in Maryland and any other place, and to celebrate the fact that people are no longer being held in slavery is in itself is a wonderful event. But to think that right here in Montgomery County you had that is just so difficult to comprehend.
Which is just the reaction Eileen McGuckian was hoping the audience would have.
I hope that a visitor today will walk away with a sense of what a momentous event this was. How joyous they were that slavery was over, but how frightening that must have been. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? How is this going to change your life?
I'm gonna sing and never get tired. Oh yes, I'm gonna sing and never get tired. Some of these days, I'm gonna sing and never get tired. Sing and never get tired. Some of these days.
Well, that's all the time we have for this show. Be sure to tune in again next time as we follow more paths to the present. I'm Gail Street. Thanks for watching.